And so I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what we do, and this really just boils down to we fight the corporate control of our food and water resources. And really in this country, and especially in California, what we're seeing is the privatization of our water supply. So corporations are, in a lot of cases, taking public water and then turning it around, selling it for massive profits, while people are going without drinking water. And so this is a huge public health, human rights issue, and we really do see water as being a human right, and so everybody should have access, but that often isn't the case. So this is a map of basically how extreme our drought is in California. You know, you can't really see the shading, but this is the darkest red of the red, and you can see it really covers most of the state. It really is talking about the intensity of the drought in California. And SoCal especially, we are what's considered a Mediterranean climate. We're not technically a desert. Like if you would go out to Mojave, that's a desert. But in California, we do get some significant rainfall in SoCal. And most of our rainfall happens here in the Sierra Nevadas. And that's where it's really important in the winter that we get a lot of rain, but snow, because the snowpack is what we rely on to store our water. And then we have super complex, we have like over 3,000 dams in our state alone. You know, so we have all of these storage and transportation systems to make sure that that snowpack is getting down to SoCal, but because we've seen, you know, extreme rises in temperature, a lot in part to climate change, and California does normally go through these drought and wet cycles. Before we settled California, we would go through 100 years, 200 years, 300 years of drought, and often we would go through 100 to 200 to 300 years of wet. And that's when we settled California, when it was actually wetter than it had ever been in the history of the state, since we were able to drill into the, into the lake beds that had been dried out. We could see, studying the tree rings, that when we settled at a nice time, but we had sort of an unrealistic expectation of just how much water we would have in the future.
Just hit space.
Okay. So I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of the hydrological system. So again, you know, you have where the rain tends to fall, which is down in the mountains. You have the water and evaporation. And what I really wanted to show was our underground water aquifers. And you can tell that when water seeps down from the mountains and gets into our rivers, a lot of that percolates into the ground. And so in California, over 50% of our state's water supply that we drink every day comes from groundwater. And so when we're in a drought, we actually depend on that so much more because we're not getting rainfall, we're not getting snow, and so we have to dig deeper into our groundwater basins. And that's kind of turned into an unsustainable cycle because we're taking more than nature can naturally replenish. So we're not getting enough rain to refill that groundwater, and we're taking too much, and it's leading to a lot of problems. So the way our water is mostly managed in California is that surface water is managed as a public good. So this is where the state can say, you know, everybody can use water, but it has to be reasonable, it has to be sustainable, but everybody needs to have access. And if I'm upstream and I'm taking, you know, my fair share, I need to make sure that you downstream can get your fair share too. And so the governor is in charge of balancing all of these water rights throughout the state. The groundwater is very different though. Even though this is a huge portion of our water supply, it's actually managed as a private asset, so it's considered private property. And this is where we get tricky, because this is when, you know, especially in the Central Valley where we have the most of our groundwater, rural communities, the farmers, they have their own private wells that tap in 500 feet below, and they've been able to get water no problem. But in this drought, big corporate agriculture has the money to drill deeper wells. And so they are lowering the groundwater elevation underground, and communities, the rural communities, the farm workers, they then don't get access, but they have no justice, right, because it's managed as private property. And so this is what we need to change, in large part in California, to put groundwater in the public trust so that we can manage it equitably, because right now it's being completely mismanaged. So there's a NASA scientist, Jay Famigletti. He works down at UC Irvine, where I went to school, but he works at JPL here in Pasadena, and he's been doing satellite imaging and testing and looking at all of the water that we have left in California. And he published this op-ed in the LA Times, I think a month ago, saying that we have 1 year left of water. With all of the water in the state that we have now, groundwater, stored in our dams, we have 1 year left at the rate of consumption that we are at right now. And that's why Governor Brown, the 1st of April, he issued the first ever executive mandatory water restrictions, right? You heard that. He was standing on that hill saying, I should be up to my neck in snow, but I'm standing on dry grass. You know, it was really fun media stunt, but then he said the cities need to reduce their water by 25%, which is totally necessary, right? We have to be realistic about where we live. Lawns are not sustainable, guys. We need to rip those out. We need to really think about where we're putting our water resources and do it in a way that makes sense for where we live. But what he completely left out of the picture was who uses the most water, who are the biggest abusers and polluters, and that leads us back to big oil and big ag, and I'm going to talk about that more. So this is Maria. She lives in the Central Valley. She's one of these rural farm workers that I was talking about, and her private well has completely run out of water. And so there was a really good piece where they did a couple of videos, and I can send that to Robert, and maybe he can send that around, where you can just really see the impact that this is having on people's lives every day. Her well ran out of water a year ago. And so now she barely has enough money as it is to support her family, but now she has to drive miles out of town, buy privatized bottled water, right? And bring that home so that she can put her water in this bucket and use it as sparingly as she can to wash her dishes, wash her clothes, feed water to her kids, and so on and so forth, bathe. And so every single drop counts, and this is the reality for almost 2 million Californians in California that don't have access to clean drinking water, and this is often impacting, poor, rural communities of color the most, right? This is disproportionately impacting blacks and browns in the Central Valley, and poor people. So that's another equity issue. So at Food and Water Watch, we talk about, food and water. So how does the drought impact fracking? What does fracking impact? Almonds we're going to go into. You've been hearing a lot about that. Bottled water, and then CAFOs, or feedlots, animal production, dairy. What is that doing when our drought? So let's first talk about fracking. This is a map of the Monterey Shale, all in through here. And this is a map, so it's the shale regions, and then just kind of generally where oil and gas basins are. And if you look at this, you will notice that this is where all of our farmland is, and this is the majority of our urban centers here down in LA. And now this is a map of where all of our groundwater basins are in the state. So there's already a lot of overlap that's pretty obvious. And this is compiling it all together, the shale, the water, and the farmland. So especially in the Central Valley, where we grow food for the nation, we're running out of water, but there is direct competition between the oil company who wants to drill deep wells versus the small farmer who can't afford to. And we're going to see what happens when that's the case. So water used in fracking, we know it uses thousands of toxic carcinogenic chemicals. The video said this water, once you combine it with the chemicals, it becomes so nasty you can't clean it up. And then that becomes even worse after you inject that, under the ground. It mixes with the oil and gas. It mixes with the radioactive materials naturally occurring in the earth. And it all comes back up as this toxic soup and sludge. And every day we're using 2 million gallons of fresh water on fracking and oil and gas, extreme oil and gas. And that's a very conservative number because we've only been keeping track just in the last couple of years of where fracking is, what chemicals are being used. We were totally in the dark. That is taken from the industry's own numbers, so we know that that's really conservative, but it's a number that we have and we're working with it. And so once that toxic water comes back up, the question is, what do we do with it? So this is kind of the most unavoidable issue of fracking and why we're calling for a statewide moratorium or a ban. All of that wastewater has to be put somewhere. You can't clean it up. And so what the state has been allowing is they've been allowing oil companies to take that wastewater and directly discharge it into aquifer groundwater basins in the Central Valley. There's one case out in Brea in Orange County, there's one case in Whittier, and there's one case in La Habra. But most of it's been happening in the Central Valley where we grow our food. Now the federal government had these aquifers protected. They were already kind of experiencing a little bit of pollution, but it wasn't so bad that it could never be used, but the oil company was just putting more waste in there, so now it can never be used. But those aquifers were meant to be backup in case of extreme drought, right? Backup for people to drink it, backup for agriculture, but instead we have permanently contaminated those reserves. And what was found was the high levels of benzene, which we know is an extreme toxic chemical, a carcinogen, was reported in that groundwater. And then the other thing that the industry had been allowed to do for decades was take that waste and dig pits right in Central Valley and Kern County, adjacent to our farmland. And normally across the country, what you're supposed to do is line these pits with plastic and other types of materials so that that water can't then seep into the ground or run off and destroy groundwater or destroy farms. But in California, we weren't doing that. So that just kind of, to me, it just strikes super odd because we like to portray ourselves as being a green state, a progressive state. We're good on the environment, not when it comes to the oil and gas industry. They are super powerful, and so regulations, it's been really hard to touch them with those. And so this was a really big case that came out a couple months ago, and now the state's trying to figure out how to get its act together. And now that we're in a drought and water supplies are dwindling, a lot of farms are being laid fallow because they don't have enough fresh water supplies. What they're doing is taking that fracking wastewater, and in some cases they're using it to irrigate their crops. Which is just insane. That food is not being tested, it's not being regulated, it's not being monitored, they're just doing it. And that food is going all over the country, and I can guarantee if you eat lettuce, if you eat strawberries, if you eat garlic, if you eat broccoli, those are the types of foods that we're growing in the Central Valley. These are the crops that we have no idea, right, if fracking chemicals have been used to irrigate them. And I don't mean to be alarmist, this is just real. This is really what's happening.
That's why I'm not vegan.
So the solution, right? Governor Brown, he should enact an immediate moratorium on fracking in the state. I personally would love to see oil and gas production stop. Climate change motivates me ultimately to do this work that I do every single day. So let's keep fossil fuels in the ground, but we can't ignore the waste issue of this, and that's why we need a moratorium. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you have heard in the news, the almonds and pistachios, they're getting a lot of the heat when it comes to this drought that we're in. Why haven't we been talking about that? Why haven't we been addressing them? And so really, the majority of these almonds and pistachios are grown on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. You're actually driving through that when you're taking the 5 up to Sacramento. You're driving through all of that acreage. And that is, so all of these cash crops, these nuts, and it's really lucrative, makes a lot of money. And despite the fact that so many farms have been forced to go fallow and let their crops die, almonds, because they are such a good cash crop and we're so enslaved to market fundamentalism, right? We just have to make the most money at the most cost of our environment. This crop stays alive. And instead of reducing how much of it we're growing, these corporate billionaires are growing more, they're planting more. And what's really insane about it is that almonds alone account for 10% of our state's water supply. Think about that. I'm going to show you a graphic on that to help you get a grasp on it. So, can't really see it, but these are where the bars come out. So, the top one says, provides water for all San Francisco homes and businesses. The next one down, produce all pistachios exported overseas. Okay, so we already see that that uses way more water than San Francisco consumes. The next one is provide water for all of Los Angeles homes and businesses. Okay, that's significantly more. And then you're looking at produce all walnuts exported overseas. So this is another huge cash crop that we grow in California in the driest parts of our deserts that are completely unsustainable, but we do it because it makes a small select few a lot of money. And then you have produce all almonds exported overseas from California. So almost 80% of the almonds we produce in California get exported overseas. So that's like taking the 10% of the water supply that we have and virtually shipping that overseas. And then finally, produce all of the almonds in California. Okay. And so not only is this a huge issue because it's just continuing to pad the pockets of a very small select few, but it was very controversial to even put these crops there in the first place because of the soils and the fact that you just couldn't have sustainable agriculture in this part of the desert. And the main part of that is that these soils are naturally toxic. They have naturally occurring selenium, which is a really heavy salt that would kill your crops normally, but instead we're growing almonds and pistachios and walnuts there. And so in order to keep those plants alive, it means you have to use, and this is where the 10% number really starts to make sense, you have to use so much more water to flush those toxins down as far as you can. And then with repeated watering, those salts rise to the surface again. And then you have to flush the whole fields, drown the fields with water just to push the salt down. And then it slowly rises back up to the top. And this is a completely unsustainable use of our water. And all of the runoff that comes from this is really damaging, and that then goes into our rivers, which goes into the Bay Delta where our fishing industry, our salmon industry is there, which then goes out to the ocean. And this has really significant, widespread impacts on our environment and our ecosystems and our birds and our fish, and it's all connected. And Westland's Water District is the name of the water district, and they are the most powerful water district in our state because they are funded by these small, wealthy few. And so they are able to get away with this because they give money to Governor Brown, they give money to our state legislator to basically be untouchable. And so I wanted to put a face to these billionaires. You may be familiar with Fiji Water. You may be familiar with Palm Wonderful. You may be familiar with Wonderful Pistachios. If you've ever eaten almonds, you've had it from these farms. But this is Stuart and Linda Resnick. They live in Beverly Hills on Sunset Boulevard. But they are extremely wealthy just because they have been able to monopolize and privatize our water supply in California. One example is that the state used $70 million of taxpayer money to build a water storage system in Kern County in case of drought so that we would have that backup reserve for the cities, for the farms. And in this really crazy deal, the governor agreed to just give them the bank. Yeah. They gave it to them, and so now every time public water enters that bank, it becomes privatized, and now they can turn around and sell that to Chevron, sell that to the highest bidder, which completely distorts, the water supply, who's getting it, who can pay for it is really the question. And if you can't pay for it, you're not going to get it. And so Food and Water Watch has taken on calling these people out, going after them whenever we can. And so this summer, what I'm really excited about is Last year we did a protest outside their house on Beverly Hills on Sunset in the median, we had this whole skit where we had actors come up and dress like them and told them, just drink Fiji water. It was pretty funny. So we would definitely want to escalate, because these guys, if you've heard of the Koch brothers, these are the Koch brothers of California. And it's not oil and gas, it's water. So it's so much more precious, it's so much more unseen, and so we're going to work with a couple of people to put together a documentary about this. I'd love for this to just get out there more and people to know who they are. And just want to highlight a little bit just how evil they are. They grow, I forget the percentage, but most of the world's pistachios come from their farms, right? I think it's like about 90%. And the only other competitor worldwide in growing pistachios are the farmers in Iran. So what they have been doing is taking their money and their power and going to DC to lobby Israel, right? Tensions, that's crazy, to keep sanctions on Iran so that we could send them our pistachios and keep Iranian, farmers who are barely struggling to survive down, so that we can keep our domination, of that market for these two individuals. So that's what they're doing. So the solution long term, we are calling for a moratorium on growing any crops on these selenium-laced soils. That is just unsustainable. And we need to make sure that farmers who have been promised water, because like I said, we settled in some of the wettest times in history. In short term, the governor should mandate sensible limits on groundwater pumping. And so the Resnicks, for example, their farm workers, their wells are running dry, but they can keep pumping. And so that goes back to putting groundwater into public trust. Okay, so animal agriculture. If you've driven up the 5 again and get that smell, you're coming up on the CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations. And all of the waste, those cows are basically standing in their own feces. All of that waste gets put onto ponds and pits, just like we saw with those wastewater pits in Kern. And that is, not only do those systems use incredible amounts of water, but they also can lead to water pollution and contamination. And so we're working to raise awareness on that as well. Our program isn't that strong on that in California. We're doing more on that in places like Iowa, where they have all hog farms and things like that. But again, putting water in the groundwater, putting water in the public trust is a good solution for that. Okay, and then finally, bottled water in a drought. How many of you have heard that Nestle, who was operating in the desert, their contract to take water out of the groundwater expired 27 years ago. But they've still been going in, bottling water, which not only creates, a pollution problem because all the plastic from the bottled waters, that goes into the ocean, that goes into landfills. That's an unsustainable use of, our fossil fuels, right? It takes oil to make plastic. But it's just another big water privatization scheme. And even though we are in a crazy drought, there are still, I'm not sure the number. Basically, our water consumption has been increasing, and even though we're in a drought, these bottled water companies are still able to go in, take groundwater out of the ground that would otherwise go to the community that's there, and sell it for massive profit. So 1 gallon of water purchased costs nearly 2,400 times as much as a gallon of tap water. So that's a huge increase in cost. And it makes water unaffordable, right? When you don't have access to water anymore because your well goes dry, and then you have to go pay 2,400 times as much what you normally would for it coming out of your tap, that is a complete injustice. And so the solution, we have this campaign called Take Back the Tap, where we work with college students and universities and towns to basically prohibit bottled water and install, refill stations and things like that. And I know the issue here in Carson, it's really concerning, right? Is our groundwater safe? And this is part of that awareness campaign. We need to take back our tap. We need to own, you know, what the deal with it is. If it's polluted, we need to clean it up. And this is just kind of part of the awareness of talking about the privatization. Okay, so then again, we need to challenge Governor Brown to lead. He is super sympathetic to the oil and gas industry. We need to force him to do a moratorium on fracking. We need to demand that groundwater is in public trust. And we need to enact a moratorium on the use of groundwater for toxic and dry soils. Okay, and that's it. And I'll take any questions.